Right, here we start. Okay, kia ora koutou. I'm just introducing Kirsten, who is the next speaker. And Kirsten was one of my master's students in 2000, and was it 16 or 40? Anyway, quite a long time ago. She did a fabulous piece of work about women who inject drugs and stigma. And I've been really pleased to see that she's kept in the space of social justice, striving for reforms in a whole range of areas, and she brings a whole load of expertise, enthusiasm, general fabulousness, and pink hair to the table. Yeah, so the pink hair people can, can bond.
I will go with that. Thank you. Thank you, Fiona.
So I'm pleased to introduce you to Kirsten today.
Take it away. Kia ora, again. And I did say to Fiona, don't tell anybody that I've stolen chocolate from your office or that you had to bribe me chocolate to finish my master's. That is true. Anyway, so we've heard so far from Warren, Fiona and Adam on the various harms and impacts of the Misuse of Drugs Act and the recommendations from the Law Commission report in 2011. So I'm just going to continue this afternoon by going over some of the various risks. So some of them Fiona and Adam have kind of already spoken a wee bit to. Anyway, so I've broadly grouped the risks that I'm going to talk about today into these headings. And I'll go through each of these headings in more detail. So we've got the risks of an unregulated market in prohibition, the impacts of criminalisation, and some examples of costs of prohibition. And when I say costs, I'm really only referring to dollar costs here, but obviously there are other costs like human lives costs in prohibition. So there's a few words on this slide, but that's because there's a lot of issues from having an unregulated market. Prohibition results in an unregulated market. What happens in an unregulated market is that there are little controls, no mandatory quality standards, no licensing requirements, and this leads to significant risks in substances. So I'll speak to a few of the issues here. With unknown substances or unknown purity, and Adam kind of mentioned his experience regarding this, this refers to the situation where people purchase an illicit substance or drug, and they assume that the drug is a particular chemical, but the reality often is that it contains something else that has potential to harm, or the substance is what they assumed it to be, but it is much more concentrated or pure. For example, fentanyl or nitazenes, which are both synthetic opiates, have been found in various substances where people thought they were buying something else. People have overdosed due to this. While services such as drug checking, which we do have in New Zealand now, yay, and Know Your Stuff, DISC and the New Zealand Drug Foundation provide this service, drug checking is important to reduce the impacts of having adulterants. However, these services are under-resourced and they can't check every substance or they can't check certain substances, so they can't get to everyone. Also in an unregulated market, there's an unpredictable supply. So this is another big risk. Prohibition offers very little in effectively controlling the supply of substances. In fact, both supply and demand of illicit substances have increased under prohibition. And again, you heard Adam about his experience where, going to prison, there was just more and more substances available. So prohibition hasn't reduced this availability or supply. Looking further down the list on the slide, at, say, untaxed money laundering, the control of an unregulated market, the market of illicit substances in prohibition rests in the hands of criminal entities and underground organisations. Disputes, transactions, and all the activities within this market inherently include money laundering and physical violence, just as what was seen in the States about 100 years ago with alcohol prohibition. So that's a broad overview on some of the risks that we have due to an unregulated market. The next group that I wanted to talk about as far as risks go is the impacts or risks of criminalisation. So just obviously there's a wee list up there of how criminalisation impacts people who use certain substances, and I'll come back to that word certain soon. So prohibition criminalises people, which has a ripple detrimental impact on theirs and other people's around them lives. So Fiona spoke about it, Adam spoke about it, that impact diminishes the opportunities for access to housing, access to healthcare, insurance policies, employment, relationships, international travel, a multitude of things. Unfortunately, discretionary approaches to possession only benefit some groups of people. A recent example that we've had in Aotearoa, when we had the 2019 amendment to the Misuse of Drugs Act, which codified the right for police to exercise discretion in prosecuting drug-related crimes. While this amendment did lead to a reduction in some drug convictions, Māori have still been arrested, convicted and imprisoned disproportionately compared with non-Māori, and disproportionately to how people consume illicit drugs. Estimates show that about 50% of drug convictions are for Māori, and approximately 65% of those imprisoned for drug offences are Māori. We're overly convicting Māori, and we're overly imprisoning Māori, not just for drug offences either. It's well known and evidence that Māori in our country are disproportionately impacted by prohibition at all levels of the criminal justice system. So this is even despite the idea of decrim or that 2019 amendment to the law. Māori are more likely to be policed, stopped, searched, arrested, charged, convicted, punished, and imprisoned. And drug possession makes it easier for that to happen. Other impacts or risks of criminalisation is that prohibition pushes people to use in secret or to sometimes use alone for fear of arrest. This can increase harm. And people are reluctant to seek help if they're needed. So Fiona also spoke about stigma. People are also afraid to ring an ambulance if an overdose occurs. This is why HRCA supports Good Samaritan law. So as Fiona mentioned, stigma. Criminalisation exacerbates stigma, and stigma increases the barriers of access to evidence-based, educational and harm reduction information. People are just afraid to say that they use illicit drugs and why they use it. They might be criminalised, they might be pushed or coerced into medical treatment, they can't access support if they do have use issues. And it also impacts on how they're treated in society. And I don't just mean barriers to employment, it is literally just socially. People, they just get treated as though they're less than others who may use illicit drugs. So the third group of risks that I want to go over, just broadly, is I mentioned that I'd be talking about the costs of prohibition. So spending. One of the risks of prohibition is where we put our resources. As a country, we spend a ton on prohibition of certain drugs. Just to put some dollar costs that the Department of Corrections spends, incarcerating someone costs corrections about $160,000 a year. That's on average. For people that...
I'm sorry, I didn't realize the number. That's a lot of drug number.
It is. Good point. So for people that are sent to prison for drug possession as their most serious conviction, this number more than doubled from 334 in 2022 to 688 in the last year. For 465 of those people, this was a 40% increase in the numbers from previous year. Drug use or possession was their only charge. So those people have no other convictions. And just if we imagined that half of those people, so just say if we took 230 people in that number, were incarcerated for 1 year, the cost to corrections of keeping them in prison for 1 year would be $37 million a year. So we as a nation, a country, are putting money in prison, policing, courts, instead of putting money and our other resources into health services, housing and education. Prohibition has also seen the encouragement or perfect situation of industries that punish people unduly and without scientific basis. So one example of that is the meth cleanup of so-called contaminated houses in recent years that saw a massive number of tenants evicted. And more than $100 million of people's money was estimated to have been spent in a now debunked moral panic of houses that supposedly needed a meth cleanup. And the last point on the slide refers to the cost of reinforcing prohibition overall. So I'm just going to show you a snippet from a recently released report. So this was released, I think, about a week ago from the Helen Clark Foundation. So it's called New Zealand's Choice, Funding Our Drug Policy. It shows that reinforcing prohibition is a staggering 68% of our drug policy costs. And if you can see right at, can I even, so see there where my arrow is pointing, harm reduction, that is 1.4% of the money spent. So to me, that's just really stark on where we're putting our drug policy figures.
Needle exchange, wasn't New Zealand the first country?
Yes. Yes, first to have a nationwide needle. We were brave. We were brave and innovative, you know. We were. We can still do that, yeah.
You know, like just,
absolutely. Here.
let's just get this done sharp.
Yep. And so looking at that total of harm reduction figures, so that's 6.9 million, whereas the corrective services, so further up, about there, is 120 million. So 6.9 million of harm reduction versus corrective services of 120 million. I mean, my brain, and I have an accounting degree, I can't even, 120 million is just phenomenal to be spending on something that causes more harm.
That's a lot of benefits for people in my salaries in this system.
It costs a lot to keep people incarcerated.
I don't mean to repeat, I have someone who they do their best, but they do not know what they're doing.
So next, I want to touch on another well-known and consumed drug and a risk of that drug with regards to prohibition. So I mentioned earlier that I was saying certain drugs are policed and prohibited. What about alcohol and prohibition? Prohibition focuses on certain drugs. It perpetuates the notion that alcohol isn't a drug. So we all use it at birthdays, funerals, weddings, meals, parties, passing exams, on greeting cards, get-togethers, any event that you can think of. The expectation is to have a bit of alcohol. And I was even thinking about that earlier this week because I flew in, I don't live in Wellington anymore, and I flew in from Melbourne, and as I was coming in from Melbourne, I am forced to go through duty-free, and as you're going through duty-free, you've got all the signs, it's cheap ethanol, cheap, and you can take 3 litres of spirits, and not a problem. And then there's, you get to customs, and it's like, oh, but you better not be bringing in drugs. You better, there's dogs there, some of them might be sniffing out for food, but, it's such a contrast, and so many people, or as a society, we don't see it. The way we think about alcohol is just so ingrained in our cultural norms, we don't see it or treat it like a drug in the same way that we treat other drugs. Our obsessive and at times unhealthy relationship with alcohol, I would argue, has to be understood within the context of prohibition, because we've marginalised some drug use and some people that use some drugs and not others. So just to sum up, I've provided a brief overview or snapshot at the risks of prohibition. I think many of you here would agree that we don't want people to be harmed unnecessarily. We want to reduce harm to people. We need to think about a way forward where we don't increase or cause harm that can be avoided for people and society. So I'm going to pass over to Julian Buchanan, who's going to speak about a way forward.